I'm Marklee with Johnston Marklee. I'm here with the SCI-Arc Channel. I'm here at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art at the Moholy-Nagy Future Present Show with the curator, Eliel.
Mark, it's great to have you here at LACMA to stand in this amazing installation design that you did for Moholy-Nagy Future Present. And I'd just love to hear a little bit about the thought process that went into coming up with this amazing idea.
It was great working with you and your team. And I think that the first challenge that we started thinking about was the different mediums that's there. And how does one produce a very coherent space so that all these different mediums could coexist together. I think we planned it in a very simple way with 6 very elongated and narrow, relatively narrow galleries where one could meander through the space in a chronological way. The second thing we did was we cut a diagonal axis through the space so we could provide as many variations and alternatives of viewing the work. So one could take a time and walk through the work in a more prescribed chronological way, or one could take this diagonal axis and cut through time, so to speak, and cut through different periods, as well as having an overview of the show. And certainly, I think from a spatial standpoint, we also want the diagonal not to be the main axis, so we have tapered the diagonal, almost causing a false perspective.
The sense of dynamism and spatial activity that those graduated doorways create with this wonderful diagonal slice is such a perfect embodiment of Moholy in using the most minimal and understated of means, but it just encompasses everything.
This black line, on one hand, it's a wayfinding mechanism for one to walk through the show, but on the other hand, it evokes baseboards of these old buildings, and the black line kind of follows around and frames the diagonal axis that forms this kind of enfilade. We painted the walls gray, but there's a gradation of grays where the first room is the darkest gray, and then it gradually becomes lighter and lighter. There are a lot more, I would say, a lot more translucent, transparent work where the shadows are very important. So hence we thought the lighter gray, which is closer to white, makes sense for that type of work, whereas the earlier work, the works on paper, the paintings, are stronger with this kind of darker color. As we were planning the project, looking at it perspectively, we thought it would be interesting to begin to taper it. So in other words, we're standing right now at the narrowest opening, and then the largest opening is at the back, in the last room. It has a reverse perspective, in the way that when we're standing here, the last wall seems closer to us. Whereas when we're standing in the opposite way, looking back, it seems very far away from this end. This way we begin to see the different gradations of the gray in a more clear way when you look down through the axis.
That notion of slight imbalance in a very beautiful, elegant way, I think is perfect for Moholy. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was a Hungarian-born modernist who believed that art working hand in hand with technology could make the world a better place. He really was a utopian. He also defined art really broadly. He worked in every medium known practically, from painting, sculpture in many, many different materials, photographs with the camera, photograms, which are cameraless photographs, collages, photo collages or photo montages. He did graphic design. He did theater design, he did exhibition design, he made films. So in the 1920s, during the years that he was at the Bauhaus, Moholy made a lot of what he called photoplastiken, literally photo sculptures, that he made by clipping images out of newspapers, magazines, incorporating them with drawings, sometimes with lettering. In this exhibition, we have what is probably the largest accumulation of these photo montages ever brought together at one time. He was interested in the notion of iteration and reiteration, so he would take one motif, and this, for example, was an image of the architect Marcel Breuer. Here he shows it 3 times horizontally. Here he shows it multiple times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, vertically, and here we have just a couple of these images of Breuer now transformed into an advertisement for a department store in Berlin. He also loved the relationship and the notion of original and copy, and was there really such a concept? So for example, here we have one of the actual, what we would think of as the original collage, that photo collage that Moholy made out of cutouts. He would take these original collages and then photograph them and turn them into gelatin silver prints that he could print up at any size. He might do them small if he was sending them out to be reproduced in a magazine or a book. He might print them very large if he was sending it out to be shown in an exhibition. There was not necessarily a limited number of prints that he would make. So this notion of being able to make work that could go out into the world and be popularly accessible was something that was really important to him. He would then often destroy what we would think of as the original. So for him, this unique original was not necessarily so important. It wasn't the height of his artistic practice. It was the version that actually could be seen in multiple copies. Moholy was really interested in industrial materials and fabrication processes, and also really interested in the notion of original and copy, or iteration and reiteration. And we see both of those interests in this group of 3 paintings here, each of which is called Construction in Enamel, number 1, number 2, and number 3. These are literally enamel on metal, which was the way that shop signs were made in Europe in the 1920s. These all date to 1923. And these are vernacularly called the telephone paintings. And supposedly Moholy designed the composition on graph paper, called up the sign manufacturer and described the composition to him over the telephone, with the manufacturer having a piece of graph paper at his end so he could take down the notations of which colors went in which grids on the graph paper. So I know you said this painting, A2, was really formative for you as an architecture student.
A2 was reproduced in Siegfried Gideon's book, Space, Time, and Architecture, and it's a Bible for students of architecture, at least in the 20th century, which I'm part of. So you never get to understand the real context until you see the real thing itself, and also see the different degrees of transparency or translucency that he tried to achieve. And standing in front of the piece and getting a sense of the scale. I mean, I remember always being fascinated by the 2 self-similar shapes. One is larger, one is smaller. Is it mainly something that's reproduced, or is one of the smaller ones actually the same size as the one in the foreground but recessed in the background? So this whole idea of is it perspectival or is it flat? I think this spatial tension is always captured in this piece for me.
Moholy loved industrial materials, as we know, and in the 1930s, plexiglass was invented. So he started taking sheet plexiglass, which he would then incise and paint on, sometimes on one side, sometimes on both sides. Then he would actually take these sheets of plexiglass, bring them home from the school where he was working, and put them in the oven at home and heat them up so that they would become moldable and shapeable, and he would bend them. Light really was an essential medium as a part of these sculptures. The transparency, the translucency of the work once it had become incised, you can see how the shadow on this piece really is a part of the sculptural form. He used this very thin plexiglass at times, and at other times he used much thicker plexiglass. This is 1-inch thick plexi that he's perforated now and bent and pierced with these metal rods to create a hanging sculpture. Now motion is a part of the sculpture itself, since these float freely in the air. The shadow that the work casts is an inherent part, an essential part of the sculpture itself. Treating one motif in a variety of mediums is something that's of interest to Moholy. He took this sculpture and he actually photographed it, both at rest and in motion. And then you see the same concept translated into painting.
So I love being in this gallery amongst all the other galleries. It has the paintings, it has the photographs, it has the books. Particularly, it has the work that Moholy-Nagy did for exhibition design and stage design. And I love how you put the film of some of the still shots of those productions right next to the drawings.
I mean, in all of his design work, you see this interest in transparency, in new materials, dynamism, the spiral that we see here, the curve of the glass wall. All of these leitmotifs that we see in the paintings and the photographs and the films come out in his design work as well.
This is one of the spaces where I really feel, for me, the intersection of architecture and Moholy-Nagy's work is very present. There's a certain generation of criticism that came maybe in the 40s and the 50s that targeted the Bauhaus group. I'm thinking of Colin Rowe in particular, who was very important in the architecture circle. And there was a very important piece that Colin Rowe wrote called Literal and Phenomenal Transparency. For that important text, Colin Rowe attacked Moholy-Nagy, saying that the notion of transparency is not structured enough. 60 years later, I think looking at the work now, nothing is accidental. This is one of the things that, for an architecture audience, it's good to revisit in relationship to Moholy-Nagy in this context. Carol, I want to thank you again for this opportunity.
I can't tell you how many people have commented on the beauty of the installation design. I learn a lot every time we talk, so thank you for that as well.
Thank you.